welcome to this British Library food season event, Food Lives, Food Scribes, generously sponsored by KitchenAid. My name is Polly Russell and I'm the season's founder and curator, working very closely with the food writer Angela Clutton, who's the season's guest director. The food season's now in its fourth year, and every year we've tried to showcase a range of topics and subjects about food, and this year is no exception. So tonight we have food manuscripts from the British Library collections. Tomorrow we're exploring food from the 1930s and 1950s with Churchill's cook and the amazing food writer Florence Wright, two historians talking about them. And then next week, we've got the amazing Madha Jaffrey, as well as an event on the politics of food restaurant reviewing, which I think will be very, very lively indeed. Do check out the food season websites on the British Library website. Just a couple of housekeeping points before we start. We love your feedback. There's a feedback box on your screen. Please do tell us what you think of our events. It's really helpful to us. There's also a donate button. The British Library is a charity and we're very grateful if you would like to make a donation. There's also a tab where you can look and browse for books for people who've contributed to the food season. And there's also a questions tab as well. So please do remember to ask us questions. Right, on to tonight's event. I am really extremely thrilled about this event because when we initially conceived the food season 4 years ago, a main catalyst for that was thinking about how we could showcase and talk about the British Library's extraordinary food holdings. And I often say that one of the things about the British Library collections that's really surprising is that although food is strictly prohibited in our reading rooms, food is arguably, possibly, a subject which is most prevalent across the collections. So because food is the stuff of war and travel and agriculture and politics, the economy, it is just everywhere in our collections. You know, in whatever format and in whichever part of the world the collections come from, food will be there, whether it's our oral history recordings, trade reports, patents, cookery book collections, of course, newspapers, manuscripts. Food is there telling us the story of the world and its history. So tonight's event is really thrilling to be exploring historical manuscripts with curatorial colleagues and experts. And our panel tonight really are fantastic. I cannot wait to hear from them. We've got Eleanor Jackson, who's a curator of illuminated manuscripts in ancient, medieval and early modern department at the British Library. She's got a PhD in the history of art, and among other things, she co-devised the fantastic Great Medieval Bake Off blog series, which sits on the British Library's medieval manuscripts blogs. I really implore you to go and have a look at that. It is really good fun and it's also fantastically informative. We've also got Jess Gregory. She is the Curatorial Support Officer for Modern Archives and Manuscripts. I know her to be incorrigibly curious and she is a tenacious researcher. She was recently responsible for, in collaboration with colleagues, the most fantastic resource guides to the British Library's food holdings from the 1600s to the present day, which is an invaluable resource for the culinarily curious. So I implore you all to go and have a look at that as well. We'll put up a link to that later during this event. And then finally, we have Michael Erdman, a curator of Turkish and Turkic collections. His PhD research focused on the written historical narratives about Central Asia, Soviet Union, and the Republic of Turkey. He's interested in art, design, identity, and language, all subjects which are closely entwined with food and cookery. So I cannot wait to hear from him either. So panel, thank you so much for joining us today. It's a real pleasure and a privilege. And we're going to work this event. Each of the panelists is going to talk for around 10 minutes about their collection area and the food manuscripts that they love, that they know, and what they tell us about food and our collections. And then we'll have a general discussion for 10 minutes, and then we'll open out to audience questions. And we would all love to hear from you, so don't forget to put your questions in the tab at the bottom of your screen. I'm going to apologise to the panellists right now because we asked them to do an impossible task, which was to just spend 10 minutes talking about collections, which I bet that they could, I imagine you could speak for what, years, weeks, the whole of your life. It's so extensive, but I know that you've compressed this into 10-minute presentations, so to give us a sort of snapshot of what the British Library has to offer in these particular areas. So thank you so much. We're going to start with Ellie. So over to you, Ellie, with your wonderful background.
Hi, thanks very much, Polly. So I work in the ancient, medieval and early modern section at the British Library in the Western Heritage Department. And our collection includes manuscripts from the 3rd century BC through to the 16th century, from ancient Greek papyri through to Leonardo da Vinci's notebooks, and all kinds of things in between. So our collections include about a dozen culinary manuscripts, all of which are from England. So there were medieval culinary collections which came from elsewhere in Europe, but the British Library's collections are particularly strong in the English material. So this is the earliest culinary recipe book we have in the collection, which was made at the end of the 13th century, which is about the time which culinary recipe books first appear in Europe. And this manuscript is in Anglo-Norman French, which was the language of the aristocracy of England after the Norman conquest. But in the 14th century, then Middle English starts to take over as the main language in England across the social scale. And you see this reflected in the recipe books as well. And from that point, from the mid 14th century, then our recipe books are usually in Middle English. So it's worth pointing out that culinary recipe collections are not the only medieval recipes that we have in the library. We also have rich collections of medical recipe books, which actually appear earlier than the culinary recipes and are more common, but these differ from the culinary collections in that they all provide remedies for specific ailments, and they often include ingredients which are pretty unpleasant to eat, and also recipes for ointments and poultices and things that weren't intended for eating at all. However, there is overlap with the culinary collections because you often get culinary recipes in medical collections and also recipes which would have been considered beneficial for the health appearing in culinary collections, because people then as now recognized that there was a relationship between what you eat and your health. There's also medieval recipes that appear in manuscripts which are not otherwise about food at all. So it's quite common to find recipes appearing just written in blank spaces in margins or fly leaves of manuscripts by later owners who were just looking for a handy bit of space to save a recipe that they wanted to use later. So this is an example from one of our medieval bake-off blog posts of a recipe for mulled wine, which is written in a prayer book underneath a prayer for St. Giles. So medieval recipes are quite different from modern ones. They're not very user-friendly. They often include no quantities, no cooking times, obscure ingredients, and very vague instructions. So they assume that users know a fair amount about cooking already. They're also often closely related to one another, so you notice the same recipes appearing in lots of different collections, often with just small variations. And this begs the question, who were they made for? And that's often really difficult to answer because these manuscripts usually don't include any direct evidence of who the original owner was, but we do have some clues. They usually include very rare and costly ingredients, And also at this time, literacy and book ownership were mostly just limited to the upper classes. So it's fair to say that our medieval recipe collections are reflecting mostly upper class food culture, which revolved especially around the feast, which was a very central ritual to upper class social life, where hosts would display their magnanimity, put on lots of entertainments, and provide excessive amounts of food. And this was also a way to reinforce social hierarchies, because there was very strict expectations of behavior at feasts and rules about who could do what. So I've chosen 2 manuscripts to talk about in a bit more detail today. The first one of these is the form of curry, which is probably our most famous medieval culinary manuscript. So this is the oldest known instructive cookery book written in the English language. It was made at the end of the 14th century, and it contains 196 recipes. So despite the name, it's not a book about kormas and tikka masalas. In Middle English, the word curry just meant cookery, so the name translates approximately as the method of cooking. The text appears in 9 manuscripts, and we have several copies in the British Library, and this one is the most famous, which is presented in the form of a scroll, and it was made in England in the 1420s. One of the reasons why the form of curry is such a special manuscript is because it begins very unusually with this introduction, which tells us all about the context of its compilation. So it tells us that the manuscript was compiled by the chief master cooks of Richard II, who it calls the best and most royal provider of food of all Christian kings. And it tells us that it was compiled with guidance from masters of medicine and philosophy, which again emphasizes this link between cookery and health. And it also claims to teach how to make the most curious potages, which are stews, and meals and subtleties, which are very elaborate kind of showpiece, centerpiece meals for all manner of states, both high and low. So we might question some of these claims, especially about how useful the form of curry would be for a beginner to learn to cook from, and also how applicable many of these recipes would be from people from a low social state. But the form of curry takes the form of a long list of recipes, and it is notable for including a wide range of ingredients, which include exotic imports such as rice, sugar, cinnamon, mace, cloves, pepper, ginger, and saffron, as well as meats, especially game meats, such as hare, rabbit, chicken, pork, deer, geese, duck, swan, heron, and curlew. A wide range of seafood, including turbot, salmon, pike, eels, mackerel, plaice, cod, oysters, mussels, lampreys, haddock, and even porpoise. And also a wide range of fruit and vegetables, including beans, cabbage, parsnips, onions, gourds, mushrooms, leeks, chickpeas, garlics, pears, dates, hawthorn berries, cherries, apples, and figs. And here, just very briefly, is an example of one of these recipes, which I made for the Medieval Manuscript blog. This is chorice, which is a sort of stew made out of cherries, and it was really quite delicious. So the second manuscript, which I have chosen to talk about today, is, it doesn't have a proper name, it's just Additional Manuscript 5467. And it was made in the 15th century after 1461, and it contains 183 recipes in Middle English. In contrast to the form of curry, which is a standalone recipe collection, you know, the recipes are the full manuscript. The recipes in this manuscript are actually only one text out of many in a miscellany, which contains all kinds of useful texts for a household. So this includes guidance on cultivating trees, unlucky days of the year, diet and regimen, and good government. So it's you can see from this that cookery is appearing as part of, as one domestic skill that could appear as within a practical guide to estate management. Now, the reason why I picked this in particular was because the recipe collection is actually appears alongside some other items about food. So immediately before the recipes are menus for 5 royal feasts. The first one, which you can see here, was a dinner given by John Fordham, Bishop of Durham, for Richard II and John of Gaunt in 1396. It's a 3-course feast with 35 dishes of all sorts of mostly game meats, including venison, cygnets, pikes, rabbits, doves, partridges, and larks, as well as things like custard tarts. And this might be useful for someone who is wanting to put on feasts themselves and wanting to imitate the kinds of menus that royalty were using. Following the recipe collections, there's also this really wonderful poem, which is a poem by John Lydgate in Middle English about table manners, which is addressed to a child, and it includes all kinds of useful advice, such as don't speak recklessly, don't fidget, keep your nails and hands clean, sit in the seat you're assigned, don't eat too quickly or people will say you're greedy, don't speak with your mouth full, don't get food on your face, don't play with your knife, don't spill food down your front, and possibly one of the best lines in Middle English literature, pick not thy nose. So you can see from this how central ideas of etiquette were to the rituals of the feast, and how eating and feasting was to a large extent to do with social presentation, and it was highly ritualized. So you can find out about these manuscripts online. The form of curry is fully digitized, and you can see it on our digitized manuscripts site. There are catalogue records for these manuscripts on our Explore Archives and Manuscripts catalogue, and you can also find out more about medieval recipe collections on the Medieval Manuscripts blog. I'll hand over.
Ellie, thank you. What a tantalizing taste of an amazing collection. That poem sounds like me every single night when I'm nagging my children. So that nothing changes over how many hundreds of years. Really, I was incredibly struck by it and would love to talk to you about what that idea of people writing in the margins of like prayer books, recipes. So I think you said mulled wine in a prayer book. So interesting about what it says about the status of a recipe then, or the status of the manuscript, and you know how, you know, whether it says something about how either of those was valued by their owners. Just really fascinating. Thank you so much, Ellie. And now I'm going to hand over to Jess.
Hello, my name's Jess. I am a Curatorial Support Officer for Modern Archives and Manuscripts. So the Modern Archives collections form part of the British Library's substantial heritage collections. Our primary focus is on British history and culture from the years 1600 to 1950. And the collection includes archives of significant historical figures, such as prominent authors, poets, scientists, diplomats, activists, and many more. We also hold the manuscript collections from donated libraries, archives of country estates, institutions and publishing houses, as well as a lot of play scripts, charters, maps, and visual materials. So not much there. The online catalogue is the best place to start for looking up manuscripts and archives. As Ellie mentioned earlier, we also have a digitized manuscript catalogue, so you can view some of our manuscripts from home. And on the right here is a subject guide that's available online and gives a general introduction to the collections and more specific details on named manuscript collections, such as the Harley manuscripts or the Sloane manuscripts. And then we're also on Twitter, and we'd appreciate lots of followers, particularly to catch up with Medieval, who have far too many. moving on. So when looking up food in the Modern Archives collections, a good place to start are these new guides, as Polly mentioned. The 3 guides illustrated on the right-hand side describe our culinary manuscript collections. So these provide information on collections relating to domestic cookery, including recipe books, household accounts, accounts of royal meals, bills of fare, and some personal correspondence relating to food. And then the guide on the left is like a summary food history collection guide. And this covers collections relating to global trade, agricultural advancements, food policy, food and empire, and food activism. So that's everything from the diary of a 17th century food trader to the bills of fare of George III to the ration books of the Second World War. And so moving on to a couple of examples. So one of my favorite items in these food collections is this commonplace book created by Elizabeth Freak. It was created in the late 17th, early 18th century. And it includes a compendium of some fascinating early modern recipes. And these are recipes essentially that she inherited and gathered and exchanged from families and friends, and then edited and wrote out in this best copy of this book. The reason I chose it is because it provides a fascinating variety of recipes. And unlike a lot of our manuscript recipe books, it also offers insights into its creator, and that's because it also includes her diaries, sort of remembrances in the manuscript as well. So this manuscript is essentially Freak's carefully curated archival legacy, recording things of importance to her, which include her collected medicinal and culinary recipes, her memoirs, poetry, and an inventory of her belongings. Looking a little closer, looking at some of the recipes in the book, what you can recognize is that she has an abundance of sugar and spices available to her. And this is reflective of a wider pattern of the sort of spread of these ingredients among the upper and maybe even upper middle classes. The focus is on sweet dishes and cakes, but the recipes also include recipes around fresh meats and fish and oysters, particularly centering still on pottages and pies. She also has a considerable amount of preserving recipes, centering on pickling and candying, and some reductions to jellies, which is quite MasterChef, I think. There's also a demonstrable influence of European cuisines, including Italian cheeses, French bread, Dutch wafers, and macaroons. Actually, these are the wafers and macaroons are illustrated here. Okay, moving on. So here's a selection of some of the recipes listed in her book. The dominant ingredient throughout is sugar, but she's also using ingredients such as almonds, lemons, oranges, aniseed, cloves, nutmeg, ginger, and pepper. And she also owns from her, illustrated in her inventory, cups for the consumption of tea, coffee, and drinking chocolate. So with Freak's manuscript, we see both a localized friends and family-based system of recipe exchange, combined with an international influence from cuisines of the continent and the increasingly abundant importation of foodstuffs from the colonies. So onto a very different example. The vast majority of food items in the modern manuscripts collections will relate to particularly affluent or prominent persons, but sometimes food can shine a light on those often excluded from the archival record. And that's why I've chosen these 2 folios from the correspondence of John Clarkson. And John Clarkson was the brother of the abolitionist Thomas Clarkson. And in contrast to the manuscript before, they're really quite simple food finds. The letter on the left is a letter requesting fresh beef for Christmas dinner. And the second is a list of women's names and a number of hen's eggs that they're donating as a leaving gift to John Clarkson. And despite their simplicity, they're actually very, I think they offer rare and important insights into a particular set of historic events. Close up. So this letter concerning fresh beef is authored by a man called Thomas Peters. He was born in West Africa he was kidnapped and sold into slavery in North America, where he was given the name Thomas Peters. And essentially, he's one of thousands of slaves who escaped and joined the British forces during the War of Independence. And this is because the British had promised them their freedom in exchange for land. Freedom and land in exchange for fighting for the British. So when the British lost the war, he and thousands of others of men and women and children who had escaped to British lines were effectively evacuated to Nova Scotia. And after years living in Nova Scotia and finding it inhospitable, basically Peters would go to England to lobby the British into providing his community with a better home. And his objective was Sierra Leone. And so John Clarkson, the man who this letter is addressed to, would take charge of that mission. So just before the Black community leaves for Sierra Leone, Peters authors this letter and sends it to John Clarkson. And the letter shows him advocating for his community. Fresh beef was rare during much of his lifetime. So he's advocating for fresh meat over preserved meat, which would have been the staple of a lot of their diets. And this letter shows Peters using his agency to seek out better conditions for himself and his community. So such archive correspondence from those that were enslaved during the 18th century is exceptionally rare. So this brief letter about fresh beef gives us a small glimpse into the voice of a man who broke the boundaries of his age. And he would become one of the founding fathers of Freetown, Sierra Leone. And this simple letter is one of the only surviving documents from Thomas Peters. And looking at the other folio, we recognize much the same. There's so little known about the women that traveled from New York to Nova Scotia and then Sierra Leone as freed Black women. There are no letters from them, and there are no autobiographies, unlike some of the male settlers. They're often just listed as so-and-so's wife, rather than by their own names. So what this list of eggs gives us, and this is from the actual colony of Freetown itself, it gives us names to put to unknown women. And from there, we can learn more about them. So, for example, Dinah Weeks at the top, I've established from online sources that she was enslaved to a man called Robert Bruce in New York before the American Revolution, and he granted her freedom. And in 1783, she left New York for Nova Scotia on the same ship as Harry Washington, who had been one of George Washington's slaves, who had also escaped to fight with the British. So these two simple food-related folios record the names and some thoughts of former slaves. These folios illustrate that because food is integral to all, it can sometimes be the means by which those so often excluded from the record can yet be discovered in the archive, and a point from which to discover more about them and their legacies. So there are other examples in the collections, such as the letters of imprisoned World War I soldiers asking for food parcels, and another example being the bills of fare of George III, which also include the meals of his footmen. So those are just a few further examples of how food can shine a light on those less represented in the collections. And that's me. Thank you.
Yes, Jess, thank you. Thank you so much. Incredibly poignant descriptions and pieces of evidence. I mean, really incredibly moving, and also really intimate as well, particularly the Freak manuscript. Just riveting. Quick question for you. Are any of those digitized and therefore available as the Peters letters? Are they digitized, and are there plans for digitization for those?
The Peters letters are not digitized. There's a couple of food manuscripts digitized. There's a Harley manuscript relating to Queen Anne of Denmark, I believe. Yeah, but that one not yet, but who knows, maybe in the future.
We'll watch that space. Thank you so much. And over to you, Michael, taking us quite long distance now, traveling some thousands of miles to different culture and cuisine.
Yes, thank you very much, Polly, and İyi akşamlar. Good evening to everyone. My name is Dr. Michael Erdman. I'm the curator of Turkish and Turkic collections at the British Library. And it's my pleasure tonight to bring you two pieces of Turkish delight, some lokum, looking at two different manuscripts within the British Library's Turkish and Turkic collections that relate to food. So what I'm going to be doing today is I'm just going to start off by looking at what the Turkish and Turkic collections are, before going on to the first of the manuscripts, which relates to the Armenian community, the second, which comes from the Balkans, and then I'll end off with a bit of information about how you can find these manuscripts and access some of the collections if you're interested in learning more about food and food culture in Ottoman manuscripts and Eastern Turkic ones. So what exactly are the Turkish and Turkic collections? Well, they account for about 30,000 printed items, rather, and 4,000 manuscript items in about 2,000 volumes. So we have quite a lot of mejmualar or codices within the collections. These are manuscripts that are, these are rather all sorts of different textual works, and in 30 or so different dialects and languages. So all of the different dialects and languages that are accounted for in the Turkic language family, if you're familiar with linguistics. And then I'm also responsible for curating the Kurdish collections in both Kurmanji and Sorani, and also Kurmanca or Zazaki. These are manuscripts in historic and also contemporary languages. So they span from the 9th century. We have some of the earliest written records of Turkic languages going right up to the 21st. So I continue to purchase materials in Turkic languages for the British Library. What are we talking about when we talk about food items or food-related materials in the collections? Well, by and large, we're talking about printed materials. So most of the food and culinary or cooking-related items are actually printed, but we do have a few different manuscript materials. You can see some of the printed materials on the right-hand side of the slide. The top one is some of the Turkish materials, the bottom, some of the Kurdish-related items. By and large, these are manuscripts that deal with, or rather printed materials and manuscripts that deal with a wide variety of different topics. So we've got food culture, we've got culinary culture, we've got cooking, we've got different uses and travel of food, the trade in food, all different aspects of the uses of food and culinary products within the Turkic world, spanning across Eurasia. And these are, generally speaking, cataloged, if they're printed materials, cataloged in the Explore catalog, and you can find it easily through explore.bl.uk. But the manuscript materials, although we don't have many items that are specifically about food, one of the things that we're working on, and we'll probably be working on for the next 10 years or so, is going through and finding those parts of the manuscripts that really relate to food. So the manuscripts do have quite a few different illustrations and illuminations that might speak about food culture and the importance of cuisine and culinary sciences in the Turkic communities. And then there are also various different descriptions of culinary practices and culture through the text. So over the coming years, we'll be trying to catalog those, document those, and make those more widely available to those who might be interested in learning more about culinary culture in the Turkic world. But I do have two manuscripts in particular that I'd like to speak to you about today that relate to food. And the first one is OR 16001. If we just bring it up on the screen. And there we go. So this manuscript is actually an Armeno-Turkish manuscript. It doesn't have a proper name, but we do find the word gıda throughout the manuscript, of food, all the way through. It's written in the Armenian script created in about 405 AD by Meshrop Mashtots, rather, and it's a sort of common practice throughout the Turkic world or throughout the Ottoman Empire that we would find people writing in Ottoman Turkish. So this is the same sort of language or within the same evolution of the language as contemporary Turkish, but written in Armenian script. So it's likely from the Armenian community of the Western Ottoman Empire. And this was a tradition that carried on throughout the Ottoman Empire right up to the genocide in 1915, and then even for a few decades afterwards in some of the post-Ottoman states. What we know about this particular manuscript is it was created in 1630. So it speaks to quite an early trend of recording different topics about food and culinary culture from the Ottoman period, from the classical Ottoman period. And we also know that it was created by a doctor. So this wasn't actually a cook. This wasn't someone who was tasked perhaps with preparing lavish feasts, but rather someone who was concerned with the proper care and well-being of their patients and of the communities in which they worked. And what we can see is on the right-hand side, the page that I'm showing here is actually about süt. It's about milk. So this doctor was looking at all sorts of different types of foods, their preparations and their uses, and how that might benefit the community at large. As we go through the manual, as I've said, this is looking at various different types of foods and different types of uses. The item on the left, we have again kuru yemiş. So we've got all different types of dried products. We have other pages that, or other sections that speak about the idea of a game, of domesticated animals, of fish, of fowl, of harvested materials, and how those might be used and what benefit they might play in the lives of the people who consume them. It's a normative text as well as a descriptive one. So it's quite an important piece of work because it doesn't just tell us what people thought you should be eating, but we're also being told a crucial part of Ottoman culture, what people do actually eat in the villages, in the cities, in the small towns. How do people collect their food? How do they prepare it? How do they store it? And this is not necessarily an anthropological study. As I've said, this was written by a doctor. And indeed, what we find throughout the text is all sorts of different information about well-being and upkeep of the human body. So on the right-hand side, all of this information about food is also paired with important information as the right-hand side, as I said, is a section about elbise, or clothing. We've got other things about proper hygiene and hygiene within the home and sanitary conditions. So we get to see already that food and culinary practice was conceived of within a broad spectrum of sciences and of well-being of the individual within the Ottoman Empire. This is something that continues on from this manuscript into the next one, which is OR 11062, also known as Kitab-ün Nebat, or the Book of Plants. This is quite an interesting manuscript because it was actually composed in 1752 so the original text, not this particular copy, but the original text was composed by a man named Abdülmenan, who was the court terjüman, or translator, for the Ottoman administration centered in Belgrade. He was a Bosniak by origin, and this particular manuscript that was created was actually a translation from an Italian work from the 16th century by Matteoli about Corrides, who I probably got that wrong, but essentially a translation or a transposition of information from early Renaissance Italy going through to the Ottoman Balkans. And so we get all of this information from the piece on the left-hand side, an Arabic note about authorship. But in fact, the copy that we see here was copied in the middle of the 19th century by a man working in Crete. So we're already starting to see the pathways in which this information travel. Why is this important? Well, because what the document contains is all sorts of different useful information about plants and culinary products. So the piece that you're seeing on the right-hand side is a listing of different names with different with different flora, listed according to edif, so arch or tree, to dan or daru, which is a medicine, jim or çiçek for a flower, or be, which is baharat, or a spice. So essentially what we have here is a listing by name, by type of plant, of the various different products, floral products that can be used in consumption, whether it's internal ingestion or it's for the actual surface of the body. On the left-hand side, we can see that they're arranged by alphabetical order according to the Arabic abjad. But what's another interesting aspect here is on the right-hand side, there's a second contents, table of contents really, where they're organized according to their uses. So if you're looking for example, how to control your nosebleeds, you might consult this part on the right-hand side, which gives you all of the different plants you could eat, you could apply to the outside of your nose, the inside of your nose, in order to control the flow of blood. And this isn't the only aspect that's really interesting about this manuscript, though, because what we begin to see is, I already mentioned sort of the provenance of the manuscript, but what we're beginning to see is that actually those names of the plants start to travel from place to place. So we're looking at the ways in which this particular manuscript gives us names of plants from different parts of the Eastern Mediterranean, transposing them from Italy to the Balkans and on to the Aegean, and then probably further on as well, giving information about different local flora, their uses, and how they might be transported to other places. So we've got information in Ottoman Turkish, obviously, in Arabic, but also in Greek, in Frankish, probably in Italian, and in Bosniak, which gives us all of these different useful plants that could be consumed, that could be used as medicine, and how they might be traded through different parts of the Eastern Mediterranean, encouraging a greater understanding of culinary culture throughout these different empires. So if you're interested in finding either OR 16001 or 11062, there are a few different ways that you could find this. About 40% of our manuscripts are cataloged within search archives.bl.uk. So you could go through our automated manuscript catalog to find some of them. But of course, not all of them are actually on there. So you might also have to consult the 1888 printed catalog, which is available on archive.org for free of charge. Even that won't have all the manuscripts acquired after 1888. So I encourage you to come through to my Twitter account, which is at Altai to Uyghur, where I post quite a few different images of these manuscripts, or to contact me directly by email, or of course to visit the Asian and African Studies blogs, which contain information about culinary manuscripts from my own section, as well as from a number of other linguistic groupings in the section. So with that, I'll wish you Afiyat Olsun, and look forward to the question section coming up just now.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Michael. I mean, I feel it is one of the great pleasures of working at the British Library that one is always discovering things you had no idea about. So absolutely, really fascinating. And clearly you've just scratched the surface of what is an incredibly complicated, rich and exciting area. I've got heaps of questions. I now realize that this event should have been for 2 hours minimum, because there's also masses of questions coming in. I'm going to just start with 1 or 2 questions from me, and then I think it's only fair to throw over to the audience. But I wanted to start with you, perhaps, Michael, to ask you, those particular manuscripts that you selected, to what extent do they resonate with what our understandings of food of that region is now, and to what extent do they differ? And then I'm going to ask Eleanor to what extent, what we can learn about sort of medieval tastes. So it's kind of a same question really for you, Michael.
I think the first manuscript, the Armeno-Turkish one, really tells us about something in terms of especially Istanbul's culinary culture, not just the idea of this mix of different traditions coming together and melding together in the cosmopolitan capital, but also the relationship between the city and the countryside, the way in which people's village cuisines influenced the way cuisine was carried out in Istanbul because people were coming and going, and also the ways in which people traded recipes. They went between communities and were traded not just because there was a curiosity about how others ate, but also because there was a value to that. They understood, the Armenian community understood that there was value in some of the dishes of the Greek community or the Jewish community, and vice versa, and of the Turkic and Muslim majority. So I think it really does reflect in quite a wonderful way this melding pot that we see when we go and we eat heartily in Istanbul or any of the cities of Turkey.
That's really interesting. And Eleanor, for you, can you reflect a bit, because obviously you've been cooking these recipes, not just researching them in the library, but you've also been trying to cook them as well. To what extent do you think that they tell us or give us some inkling of what taste was like, or what tastes were favored in medieval times?
Yeah, I think one of the most striking things about actually cooking these recipes is how tasty they are. I think there's an impression that medieval food was maybe quite basic, or especially that English food historically was quite bland. But that's absolutely not the case for the recipes that we've made in the medieval bake-offs. They're often really powerfully flavoursome, sometimes, more than the modern palate would normally prefer. So for example, the chorizo, which I showed you, it's cherries with almonds and then a huge range of different spices and aniseed, and it has this really strong there's the earthy spice flavor, but then there's also the kind of herbal aniseed flavor, as well as the sweet fruity flavor, and it's really quite powerful and very unusual kind of flavor combinations. And I think that's quite typical of the sorts of medieval recipes you get in these collections. Yeah.
That, I think, and what's also really fascinating about that, and I'm sure Michael could talk about this more, but it obviously the kind of connection between the Middle East and medieval cookery and those kind of spices, the dried fruit, and the kind of flavor profile being very sort of similar or resonant, and kind of how food was traded and traveled and ideas were traded and traveled. Jess, can I ask you a question about what you think manuscripts as compared to sort of published cookery sources tell us? You know, what do they allow us to learn about food, cooking, culture, or the owners of those manuscripts that published material doesn't?
Well, I think particularly of the time frame that I was looking at with the Freak manuscript, that published books at the time have you have a more set objective, you have a particular scope that they're trying to attain, and whereas the manuscripts have a sort of less restriction in their conception and generally a broader sort of scope. So you're going to have more of the personal, experimental. There's often sort of recipes being tried again or crossed out. More of sort of domestic influence. You know, there's the Freak manuscripts has references of how her manuscripts come to her from her extended family, from her sister, and this sort of system of exchange is you can get this sort of tangible sort of network of food, recipe exchange. But then also, I think you get in some papers that we hold, things that just don't make it into books at all. So we have the papers of food traders from the 17th century. So we have a man called Thomas Stringer, whose book I can barely read because the script is beyond me. But he talks about planting saffron and licorice and trading rabbits and turnips, and this is all sort of a ground up details of what was happening at this time, rather than the sort of sort of printed cookery books that are trying to tell people what they should aspire to, what a king's kitchen looks like. I think you can get more of a sort of more breadth to what was actually happening food-wise at the time when you look at some of the manuscripts resources.
Yeah, and I suppose also the thing about a manuscript, particularly if it's a sort of recipe manuscript, it actually tells you what people actually cooked rather than what other people would like you to cook. It's not instructive in the way that a published cookery book is a kind of, in a sense, got a bossy, it's aspirational, it's telling people what they should cook. That actually tells you what they probably did cook, which I think is, and that kind of level of intimacy is really fascinating. I'm going to say to people, keep sending the questions in, but I'm going to turn to the questions because there are so many. There's a question here for you, Michael. So someone's saying they'd love to hear more about the Italian influence in both English and Turkish culinary collections. I guess for the Turkish collections for you.
Yeah, so in the both manuals, I would say much more the or 11062, the Kitab-ı-Nubat, we get quite a lot of Italian influence. Obviously, it's from an Italian work, but what I think is really quite interesting is there's sort of a general thing. There are obviously plants that grow all over the Eastern Mediterranean, including in Italy. So we get some of those that we can see where, okay, someone in Italy would use this, but also someone in Greece and someone in Anatolia. But then there are particular plants where there's only really Apulia or Le Marche where they grow. And so suddenly what we're starting to see is essentially this is meant to be a copy of a text, but we're getting the transmission of that information about what sort of plants can be used and how they can be used and how they can be prepared and then applied to the individual. That's really so specific that sometimes the word that's being used in Turkish seems very bizarre. And there's only probably a dialectal word from Apulian or from Abruzzese that's being used to describe this plant that's then entering really the knowledge base for Ottoman practitioners. So there's already sort of, we're seeing from this one particular manuscript, the ways in which, although it's really just the translation of a manual that's perceived as being useful, that culinary knowledge of how Italians in particular regions would have eaten and how they would have cultivated food, how that then spreads into knowledge in the Ottoman Empire and then is circulated throughout all of the different lands.
Gosh, and over to you, Eleanor, as well, in the extent to which you see kind of culinary influences like that, and sort of culinary exchanges and ingredients sort of moving and between sort of different regions.
Yeah, in the medieval recipes, you can certainly see that very self-consciously international, and you get a sense that people were showing, you know, how cultured they were by the kinds of exotic foods they were eating. So you often have recipes where it'll be called, you know, so specifically for Italian ones, there's one which is Lombard tarts, which is a very common recipe that appears in these collections, which I assume was meant to be from Lombardy. I don't know to what extent is genuinely reflecting that. It's a kind of custard tart with fruit in it. And you also get things like, you know, German, blah, blah, blah, and French. So yeah, there was certainly a lot of interest in other cuisines, and certainly there were lots of imported ingredients coming from all around the world that were influencing the food that people ate. Yeah, that's the only example of a specific Italian link that I can think of off the top of my head, though.
I think you've done very well, given the size of the collections, and yeah, that's great. There's a question here about that you mentioned, Eleanor, that in medieval recipes there aren't sort of specific quantities, ingredients are mentioned, but they're not the same form as a recipe that we understand a recipe to be. When do we start to see recipes taking on the form that we recognize now, and is there any particular driver behind that change? Jess, do you know about that, and when do you see that in your collections of 1600s onwards?
Well, I think you do start. I mean, obviously, I don't know too much before the 1600s, but you do start seeing it in our manuscripts of using quarts and pints and measures. And I think that would probably be because you have this sort of tradition arising of collecting recipes. So instead of sort of like the form of curry, which is a display of you know, this royal selection of recipes, you have this system that emerges in early modern England, where people are exchanging their recipes to each other. So you need a little bit more direction if you are going to be able to actually work off your recipe, then rather than just display it as a sort of you know, a token of wealth. So they do become slightly more practical, even though, I mean, yeah, we do have some. I was reading some of the examples, and you could just about follow quantity-wise what Elizabeth Freak is wanting you to do, and she does describe a quaking pudding in this way, and she even says at the end that it should quake like a leech. Is how she summarizes the end of her recipe.
Like a leech.
Like a leech, yeah.
suddenly, no one's making it. Yeah. But I think that's really interesting, the way in which they are sort of almost aid memoirs, that they assume a certain sort of knowledge and sort of expertise and learned skills, and rather than being, you know, there for the total novice. Here's one for you, Michael. Someone whose thesis was on the decline and fall of the Byzantium, but they know very little about food traditions. However, since they had a well-known and full-blown court tradition, the questioner assumes that they had a wide range of high status, sophisticated dishes. However, what writing in this area survives, and how much, if anything, of the Ottoman court and feast cookery derived from pre-existing Greek traditions, brackets obviously an area of some contention, or did they have their own court traditions developed away from their nomadic roots before they conquered Constantinople? Again, could you answer that question in 1 minute, please? I'm sure.
I'll try.
I'm sure there's not much to say.
It's easy with the Byzantine part, which is that I'm not a specialist in the Byzantine, so I'd have to refer you to the medieval manuscript section for that. But in terms of the Ottomans, they did certainly bring certain aspects of their culinary traditions from Central Asia. So we've got things like manta, which are clearly Central Asian. They're like mandu in Korea. You find them all over Central Asia and across all of Eurasia. That obviously these are Central Asian dishes or Eastern Asian dishes that would have traveled from Central Asia with the Oghuz invaders as they were coming in. But then when you look at a lot of other aspects, obviously there's got to be quite a massive influence of Greek and also Armenian and Arab and other communities in Turkish cookery. And if you're going to have an idea of this, when you start to look at things in terms of the names of foods, look at all of the different seafoods that there are. A lot of the different foods connected with the sea, although obviously the Ottomans had been living by the sea for centuries, they are Greek words. And there are a lot of different corruptions of Greek words, Turkifications of Greek words for many different dishes that we find as standard Turkish dishes that would have been in the Ottoman court that clearly are adaptations of the original inhabitants or the original communities and cultures that the Ottomans encountered when they first arrived, and then gradually settled, and especially after 1453 with the capture of Istanbul, of Constantinople at that time, and the inclusion of these communities within a broader Ottoman society.
Thank you very much, Michael. That was a huge piece of history just compressed by magic. Eleanor, there's a question here about vegetarian recipes in English medieval collections. And the reason I want to ask you this is because I think what you've talked about sort of really unsettles perhaps a stereotype, probably due to sort of Hollywood, of food in the past or in that period being sort of unsophisticated, people sort of sitting at large tables and sort of throwing, I don't know, great legs and hunks of meat around. And actually what you've suggested and that these manuscripts suggest is that this food is very sophisticated. It's really, very sort of clever, it's refined. And I wondered about the kind of, and I think this question is asking about the kind of relationship between vegetable dishes and meat dishes and whether there's a kind of trend in some of these manuscripts that you see.
Yeah, so a lot of these manuscripts, which are based on the kinds of foods that people were eating at feasts, are really quite meaty. And the menus especially are very meat dominated. But alongside those, there are also a lot of vegetarian recipes. And these would have also been served at feasts, but also, and we explored this in one of the medieval Bake Off blog posts, is that when people were fasting, then fasting was a really important part of medieval life, because the church calendar very much dominated people's kind of daily experiences. And there were significant portions of the year where everyone was fasting, and during fasting periods, then meat was completely forbidden for everybody, except the very poor and the very sick and the very old. So actually, a lot of the time, people were eating vegetarian, and which is why there's such a large number of vegetarian recipes in our collections. And also it's worth pointing out that this was also very class related. So although there's quite a high proportion of meat dishes in these recipe collections, you also had all these peasant class, which would have had much less access to meat and would have probably been eating a vegetarian diet a lot of the time.
I would love it. I think we should do another event on thinking about what these collections tell us about kind of ordinary people's food, the sort of food of the everyday, of the poor. And that is such a kind of sort of reversal of the way in which vegetarianism or so veganism is sort of now associated with kind of status in a sense, and that kind of the way in which meat is associated with status in the past. I mean, I know that is more complicated than that, but something to discuss for next time. We are nearly running out of time, but there's one terrific question here which I think would be fun. If you have an answer to it, why don't you put your hands up and I'll come to whoever does, and all of you feel free to answer, because this is from someone who works in special collections, and she's asking, or they're asking, have you ever found bits of actual food in manuscripts They have come across squashed insects, grease stains, wax and dried flowers, but nothing that could unequivocally be identified as leftovers of yore. No, our collections are immaculate. That is right, and that's what conservation would like to know, to hear. With huge reluctance, I'm going to have to bring this to an end. I'm so sorry that we didn't get to answer so many of these fantastic questions. This is just evidence that people are just fascinated by this subject, by these collections, and by the wonderful presentations that you gave. To the audience who are listening, I implore you to go seek out Eleanor's blogs on the medieval manuscripts blogs for the British Library, seek out Jess's fantastic resource guides, well, the British Libraries, but compiled with very much the help and energy of Jess. They are extraordinary. And also follow Michael on Twitter. You will not regret it. It is great fun. And he posts wonderful images and information. Just fantastic. And check out the British Library's website. We hopefully have whetted your appetite for what are the most extraordinary collections. There is obviously so much more to say. I want to thank my panel who have done a tremendous job in talking about these wonderful collections in a very short period of time. I'm sure I'm going to be asking them back for food season next year for sure. Thank you also to the audience for listening. Thank you to KitchenAid for generously sponsoring the food season. Don't forget to check out the events which are taking place over the next 2 weeks. And thank you very much. Good night.